Would it be unfair then to say that last year was a culture issue in those spots with the depth concerns that you just mentioned? Is that statement then a little bit inaccurate since so much of that seems motivated by what the roster's limitations were more so than anything there? Is it unfair for Kevin to have called that a culture problem based on their roster then?
Yeah, I think it may have been unfair for him to to use that as an example of there being a culture problem, right? Because at that time, you have to call a spade, right? That roster, after he goes out with no Joe Harris before the James Harden trade, I mean, you don't really have any shooters. You don't have any other playmakers. Patty Mills hit a cold stretch, and now you're doomed. But I mean, outside of that, Kevin just wanted there to be accountability for everybody to be putting their all into basketball, which sounds like he wanted Kyrie to be there at all times, right? That's one way of reading between the lines. But another way of reading between the lines is, he's pointing to that stretch saying, hey, we shouldn't have lost those games. There's also a coach that needs to be accountable for that as well. So you can say culture, you can say roster. There's a bunch of different ways to skin the same cat. But at the end of the day, Kevin said, I want there to be championship habits here like what we had in Golden State. And that's what this team is going to have to start building on right now from training camp.
Are there things that Steve Nash has improved on or things that he still needs to improve on heading into this season as a coach?
I don't know what he has improved, though, because we haven't seen him coach a game yet. So I'll have a better answer for you preseason game 1, preseason game 2. But, he didn't necessarily get into specifics, which is kind of interesting. He can be like that sometimes. When we're asking him, hey, how do you reflect when a player calls for your job? When a player of Kevin's caliber at that calls for your job, first thing he says is, number one, as I told you, he didn't believe that those reports were completely true. Number two, he said, families fight. But at the end of the day, we worked it out and we found a way to move forward. I'm interested to see what happens if the Nets hit a rough patch, right? What if the Nets start slow? What if they go 3-7 in their first 10 games? I'm interested to see what happens when the adversity hits, because that's when we'll know what type of coach Steve Nash is. Last year, things fell off the wheels, but you could point to COVID, keeping Kyrie out. You could point to injuries. You could point to all those things as reasons why the team didn't do well. This year, you've got a clean runway. And if things don't go clean those first few games, that's when we find out what type of coach Steve Nash is. But I've got a feeling these are going to go well because of the way the team has really been addressing all these issues that happened during the offseason. And they seem pretty focused as a team. They seem connected. It's only training camp game 1. So I can't wait to see what they look like in a week or two.
Does that include Ben Simmons? Because I feel like we had such a long period where there was nothing coming out of Ben Simmons and his camp. It was very quiet. The injury certainly had a lot to do with that down the stretch of the season. There was all that stuff about him leaving group chats and what the communication was like with the team about him coming back from injury during that postseason run. So is there any hangover from that, or is this also a player who's just back in a mode for a new season?
Well, speaking of the group chat thing, number one, I reported earlier that wasn't necessarily the case, and then Ben went on JJ Redick's podcast and basically just completely called that 100% false. But to your point, Ben is healthy both physically and mentally, and we haven't been able to say that about him in a year plus, right? He's been dealing with back issues. He's been dealing with mental health issues, and he seems to have put both of those behind him. He was shooting jump shots today, knocking down some corner threes in practice. Make of that what you will. Whether he's shooting them in games or not, we don't know. Says he wants to shoot some, so we'll see. I think that Ben is kind of a key that's going to make this whole thing go. You've got a player who can defend all 5 positions, who can play almost all 5 positions, and who's going to go out there, get you rebounds. Markieff Morris called him strong as hell today. That's coming from a strong guy, Markieff Morris. I think Ben is going to – what's interesting? Patty Mills called him it was Seth Curry. Seth Curry called him kind of underrated now at this point of his career, which is crazy because he's been gone for a year. But this is a guy who, we're talking about all NBA, all first team, all defense. This is a guy who can really be a tone setter for this Nets team. I'm looking forward to seeing him back on the floor. What that looks like, I don't know. But everyone is saying he looks incredible out there on the floor. So I can't wait to see him in preseason game 1.